Welcome to our program on Kardec Radio. And now, here's our host, Dr. Vanessa Anceloni.
Welcome, dear listener. This is Kardec Radio with you to bring you nourishing for the soul. It's all about the overcoming of our fears. Who doesn't have fear? We have a physiology that is wired to process fear because fear is related to our instinctive nature. What do we do with it? How do we overcome it? Can our spirituality change our fears? Can we reframe it? These and many other questions may be answered today and bring to all of us a new perspective on fear. And to help us bring this to a new level of awareness, we have here today with us Dr. Srini Pillai. He is here with us. He is this amazing psychiatrist from Harvard, the McLean Hospital, who has been doing great work at the Outpatient Anxiety Disorders Program. He is also a certified master coach and faculty on the Behavioral Coaching Institute. He is a public speaker. He is also the CEO of Neurobusiness Group, which is an executive coaching company focused on enhancing social intelligence in companies. He is this very bright mind who is bringing a difference in not only on the study of the mind through the neuroscience of visualizations and much more, but the proposal that we can be empowered to live a better life. He is also the author of amazing books, Life Unlocked, 7 Revolutionary Lessons to Overcome Fear, Your Brain and Business, The Neuroscience of Great Leaders, The Science Behind of the Law of Attraction. We're going to be talking to him very soon. Before we get there, let's think about the topic today. Dear listener, you may have fear. I do too. Who doesn't? What do we do with it? In the Spirit's book by Allan Kardec, at its introduction, we have an amazing statement. Allan Kardec said, among the causes of insanity, we must also include fear. What a statement. So fear can trigger insanity. It's something that it's beyond the fear of death. It's beyond the fear. How many people, they become so afraid of even leaving their homes. Because of that, they lose their jobs. They develop psychopathologies. And what do we do? If you want to ask questions to us, to Dr. Pillai today, call in at 858-769-4705. Again, 858-769-4705. We're going to be giving you new tools. And the thing is this, we need to dive very deeply into our faith. Because faith is certainly one of the ways out of fear. And as in the Gospel according to Spiritism, we have Allan Kardec in one of the chapters, chapter 19, talks about faith that moves mountains. Faith, the mother of hope and charity. Faith is this divine inspiration from God that awakens us all the noble instincts that lead humans towards the good. It is the foundation of regeneration. Thus, this foundation must be strong and durable, for if the least doubt shakes it, what will become with the building that you built upon it? Therefore, build this foundation upon unshakable foundations. Let your faith be stronger than the sophisms and ridicule of disbelievers. For faith that cannot stand up to human ridicule is not true faith. And thus, dear listener, we have the invitation today to strengthen our faith in true reasoning. The unshakable faith is the one that is solidly founded in reasoning. This is Allan Kardec. Allan Kardec bringing you perspective. By the way, Kardec Radio is also on iTunes. You can listen to our shows Just download all the programs for free in iTunes, and you can listen to the shows on demand on your iPhone at any time. You can also listen to the show on our web, kardecradio.com. And if you want, you can also go to blogtalkradio.com/KardecRadio and get all of the previous shows. Plus this show, you can listen to these shows live through your mobile. Go to our website and find out how, www.kardecradio.com. And Kardec Radio is completing today 3 months. And 3 months, we have listeners in more than 45 countries. Can you believe it? Oh yeah, people have been sending many emails saying they love Kardec Radio because it brings new perspective. That's why we're here, to counterbalance the sad news that, unfortunately, we have a very unsettled journalism in the world that only shares sad stories. But there are so many good stories out there. People who are kind, who are charitable, who are bright, like Dr. Srini Pillai. He is here with us today to enlighten our minds and our hearts with a new understanding. We love science. Science can bring us a new perspective, confirmation of many things that Spiritism had said a long time ago. And to give us a glimpse of how much Spiritism and science are so intertwined, last Sunday, September the 25th, we were in New York in an amazing event at the Ellen Mills building, the theater, to talk about It's Good to Be Good. Dr. Stephen Post was there to tell us the news about how science can prove to us that it's good to be good. And we were there as well talking about how to raise altruistic kids. Adriano Barba was there very inspirationally telling us about the little good that we can do and can make a huge difference. And then Dr. Claudio Petrillo was there sharing his very personal and moving story, and then the amazing books that he's bringing through automatic writing directly from his son, who died when he was only 20 years of age. And to hear more from the organizers of this very event, listen to this interview that Kirsten DeMello did for us right after the beautiful event in New York, the third Spiritist Forum of New York.
This is Kirsten DeMello with Kardec Radio at the third Spiritist Forum of New York with some of the organizers, main organizers, Adriano Barbo and
Eduardo Guimarães.
That's right. I can never say your last name, Eduardo. We are here at this blessed event we just finished up, and I just want to get some feedback from both of you how this third Spiritist Forum came about in the making of, the behind the scenes. If you just could briefly tell me how that was for each one of you coming together as collaborators, also with other people. We can start with here our friend, Mr. Barbo.
Actually, the Spiritist Forum of New York is the third one, and the first one was like inspired by Vanessa and Ceylon. Once I were in her house, like maybe 3 years or 4 years ago, and we were talking about having a event in our Spiritist home in Mount Vernon to celebrate our anniversary. And then she thought, why don't we make a forum? And then we set up to make our first forum that was in Portuguese. And then I told her that I promised her that the next one will be in English. And then came the second and the third. This one was more challenging, came to us because, first of all, the Stephen Post was, I told Vanessa that I liked him so much, doing a lot of good around, even in universities, founded the Institute of Unlimited Love. And she told, do you want me to contact him and maybe he accepts it? And then he accepted the invitation to come to talk to us. And then we scheduled the other speakers. I was counting to have the Casa do Brasil, which is the place that I was thinking that we'd held this event, but at the end we couldn't make it there. And then I desperately was looking for another places to rent it, and finally I found it. this one here, but it was kind of expensive to rent it. They required so many things like insurance, and even today, we're about 7 p.m. We have until 7 p.m. to go out of here, otherwise we're going to pay like $300 more. But that's okay. It's always, we are here for it. We don't care, much about the money that we spent. We did it with heart, and if we have to go more 1 hour, that's okay, or something more. That the vaccine was, most of it was hard to put it together today, because we are not many workers around. We had to many collaborate, like Edward and his spiritual center. Even that he closed the spiritual center there for the people to come here was a tremendous support that we don't have, asset to pay him back for his collaborating. So we thank him so much, and all the others that came.
And for those of you, obviously, who are listening on the web and were not able to participate here tonight, you will be able to purchase your own copy of the DVD later. At a later time, we will announce that on the radio show where and when you can purchase that. And for those of you who were not present tonight, it was truly a healing meeting tonight of great minds coming together with this phenomenal work, not just under the banner of Spiritism, but under the banner of love that Christ always proclaimed. And real quickly here we have our friend also and collaborator, Eduardo, to give us a brief overview as well with this event here tonight.
Well, we as group, the Inner Enlightenment Spiritist Society, we were just little helpers because 99% of the work was done by the Mount Vernon Spiritist Center. So we just helped with the book sale and the opening prayer, which for us, and closing the center, that is kind of something that we have to do because this is a Spiritist movement. We are working together for the same cause. So participating here or participating in the center came to the same. And being here all together from different Spiritist centers just make the Spiritist movement stronger and make our bonds stronger also.
And on behalf of all the Americans, we truly thank you. And English speakers across the globe who will one day hear this, whether in the very near future, very far future, we thank you for doing this entirely in English. And one last comment by Mr. Barbo.
Edward told that they gave 1%, like was my talk, but that 1% make all the difference for us.
There you have it, folks. We have nothing but givers around this. And I'm Kirsten DeMello with Kardec Radio, and have a blessed day.
What a beautiful interview that Kirsten DeMello brought to us. And God bless the heart of Adriano Barbo, his group, and also the group of the Inner Enlightenment Spiritist Society, who was there supporting with the leadership of Eduardo Guimarães and Elder as well. So God bless their hearts. It was a beautiful event. Dr. Post was also impressed. He sent us an email saying he was quite impressed with the Spiritist community and he wants to collaborate more. We're delighted. We're delighted to know that we are in this good partnership with the bright men of science. And amongst them we have Dr. Pillai here with us. And to kickstart this show in great joy, because we're going to talk about fear, but the end of the story is that we probably can overcome it. Dr. Pillai is going to tell us how. He's going to bring us the ins and outs of it. And to brighten our minds, let us listen to this beautiful prayer on joy that was put together by the Spirit Meimei through the hands of Chico Xavier, the great Brazilian medium. Listen to this, get inspired before we go to our first break and bring in Dr. Pillai.
Joy. Joy is the song of the hours when God caresses your passage through the world. Everywhere flowers bloom as smiles of nature, and the wind combs the field's hair with resting music. The water from the fountain is liquefied care in earth's heart, and the small golden grain of sand is a message of joy from the ground. Do not allow, therefore, that your difficulty, transforms itself into numbing sadness for others, even if everything appears to conspire against the happiness that you await, lift your eyes to the smiling face of life that envelops you and bolster joy wherever you go. Bless and serve always, even among tears. The rose, although subjugated by thorns, still offers its perfume, and sunrise awaits generously for the night to finish in order to renew itself. Daily, in a party of love and light.
We will return to our program after these messages.
Kardec Radio, live every Saturday at 11 a.m.
Nourish your soul with Kardec Radio.
Join us every Thursday, live, Evolution in Two Worlds, a journey of the soul through the teachings of the Spirit Doctor, Andrea Luiz. Connect at www.tvcei.com, Channel 2.
Nourish your soul with Kardec Radio.
Enrich your spiritual senses and deepen your foundations of Spiritism with the book, What is Spiritism? By Allan Kardec. Buy your copy online or via your ebook reader. Go to www.ediceiofamerica.com today.
And now we return to our program.
Overcoming Your Fears. The show is about why do we feel afraid. Allan Kardec, in the Spirit's book, he states in the introduction, among the causes of insanity, we must also include fear. In the book No Solar, by the Spirit Dr. Andrea Luiz, through the hands of Chico Xavier, we learn in a whole chapter about the problems that fear can cause. Fear is so detrimental to us that it can cause a lot of destruction. It can be even contagious. So we need to make efforts to overcome it. Even Emmanuel said through Chico Xavier that we should be afraid to being afraid. So here we have with us one of the leading authorities in the neuroscience of therapeutic visualizations, Dr. Srini Pillai. He is a psychiatrist, assistant clinical professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He has a clinical practice in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He works as a psychiatrist at the McLean Hospital. He is also the CEO of Neurobusiness Group. He is a public speaker, brain imaging researcher, and a certified master coach. He has written books such as Life Unlocked, 7 Revolutionary Lessons to Overcome Fear, and also Your Brain and Business, The Neuroscience of Great Leaders, and the most recent book, The Science Behind the Law of Attraction. Dr. Srini Pillai is here with us live. Hi, Dr. Pillai. Thank you so much for being with us at Kardec Radio.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be on.
We are honored to have you here because we're talking about one of the most intriguing parts of human mind, fear. Who doesn't have fear, right, Dr. Pillai?
Absolutely. Fear is one of those ubiquitous emotions, and I think one of the reasons it affects us so much from a scientific standpoint is that people believe that from an evolutionary standpoint, fear was initially coded into our brains in order to help protect us from threat. The problem is that whatever this coding has been so automatic that in a lot of situations where fear is not necessary, it still presents itself.
Exactly. So, Dr. Pillai, when we talk about fear, we know, for example, this statement that we just mentioned, that one of the causes of insanity can be triggered by fear. And how could our listener understand better this mechanism that fear can trigger insanity?
Well, I think one of the first things to look at with that question would be, what is insanity? And I think that there are some core definitions and then probably some areas that are a little bit more subjective. Just for the purposes of this discussion, I would say that when we're talking about insanity, what we're talking about is having a thinking or emotional or perceptual state that results in a disruption to your life. And what we know is that when we look at the core of anxiety disorders, when we look at panic disorder, when we look at social anxiety, when we look at obsessive-compulsive disorder, we find a tremendous amount of fear. When we look at the core of issues such as depression or mania, fear plays a very important role. And when we look at the core of issues such as psychotic disorders, such as schizophrenia, fear is also a very instrumental part of this. So we know from the research that fear plays a significant role in a number of what we now call psychiatric disorders or insanity. But fundamentally, what fear does is it affects the emotion centers in the brain and the thinking centers in the brain. And as a result, it can distort your experience of life and your perception. And it is this distortion that may come to express itself in what we are calling insanity.
Quite interesting. And you focused in the book, Life Unlocked, 7 Revolutionary Lessons to Overcome Fear, different ways to understand fear, but also to overcome fear. And you mentioned that fear is the number one roadblock to people's happiness. How so, Dr. Pillai?
Well, one of the perspectives that I use in Life Unlocked is describing the fact that emotions are processed by the brain. And one of the key emotional processes in the brain is a structure called the amygdala. Now, usually, this emotion processor can process a number of different emotions. But when there is fear jumps to the head of the line and takes up the mental processing ability. And as a result, effectively, metaphorically displaces happiness from the amygdala so that fear comes to the front of the line and says, hey, I want to be processed because I'm the number one emotion, and happiness has to leave. And I think a lot of what I talk about in Life Unlocked is how to change this phenomenon so that happiness can get back to the front of the line while we manage our fears.
You're talking about the possibility of reframing it, right?
Reframing is one of the things that we can do. So in terms of what we can do with the fear and how we can change this fear, there are a number of different strategies. In fact, I outlined these using a mnemonic in Your Brain and Business, but a lot of these strategies are also described in Life Unlocked. Reframing, I think, is one of the key ways in which we can change our fears. And studies have actually shown that if you reframe a situation, you may actually change amygdala activation. So reframing, a lot of people will say, well, why should I tell myself the same story in a different way? The truth is still the truth. Well, what we find is, if you say, for example, I think it's impossible for my life to get better, that can make you anxious and it can stimulate the amygdala. If, however, you say, right now I feel stuck in my life, but I must look for ways to get out, that is a very different instruction to give to your brain, because then you're telling your brain that a solution is possible. And that reframing can actually take the anxiety out of the question and reduce it. And the way we see this in the brain is we actually see an improvement in the thinking parts of the brain and a decrease in activation of the amygdala.
But when we're talking about structural components of this emotional processing, when we are talking about fear, is it also that when you're reframing, you're giving messages to higher centers, for example, the prefrontal cortex in the processing, to give a feedback to the amygdala and activating it in a different manner, or even inhibiting it in some way and level?
Absolutely. That's a great question, because I think what that speaks to is, I think the implicit question is, so what if fear activates the amygdala? And what we know is that the amygdala, which is the emotion processor in the brain, is connected to the thinking parts of the brain, and like the prefrontal cortex. And we know that when the amygdala is overactivated, it actually starts to disrupt the prefrontal cortex. And so and this disruption of the prefrontal cortex then goes back to affect the amygdala, and you often get a vicious cycle. So to your point, I think what reframing does is it helps adjust what's going on in the thinking brain so that the thinking brain can then start to put the reins on an amygdala that has been out of control. And reframing is one of those methods. In addition, there are a couple of other things that I think we need to pay attention to. There are things like reassessing different situations, refocusing on things, resolving existing conflicts, re-engaging the situation in a different way. And we can go into detail with each of those if you'd like to. But essentially, I think, to your point, the thinking brain or prefrontal cortex can be accessed through very specific mechanisms to try to control that so that in turn can control the excessive activation of the amygdala.
And Dr. Pillai, so what you're saying tells us that when we're thinking, we are creating some form of impact in our brain. Not only, science tells us that as we think, it's being produced by the brain, but as we produce this thought, it's as if it's making an effect in our neurotransmission in itself. So we can tell that if we change our thoughts, we can change our life. Are we right?
Absolutely. Because, what eventually matters is the kind of message you're giving to your brain. The way that people live their lives is they live their lives through certain actions. They either work successfully or they're in relationships successfully and a host of other activities. And in order to perform actions, your brain has to navigate you to the place that you want to go to. So let's say you want to be in a job that makes you more money. You want to be in a more satisfying relationship. Whatever the message is that you want to give to your brain, the brain's navigator or the GPS system is the posterior parietal cortex. And the posterior parietal cortex actually gets messages from the rest of your brain to try to help you navigate your way to where you're going to. So when you're thinking in a negative way, and when you're thinking something's just impossible, and I've lost my job, and I don't really know, I probably am never going to be able to regain my economic stature. The way that the kind of family that I come from means that I'm never going to be able to be well off, or I've been disappointed in a number of relationships. I'm never going to be able to get the right kind of relationship. When you talk in that way to your brain, what I call that is impossibility talking. And so what people will say is, when you talk in that way, basically you're telling the brain's GPS system, don't worry about it. It's impossible to find a solution. No need to even look for one. Whereas if you say to yourself, I don't know the solution to my economic recovery. I don't know the solution to finding a better relationship. I don't know the solution to having a better situation at home. But I do believe that there's one, and that's to your point of faith that you mentioned earlier in the show. That starts to activate what I call possibility brain. And then the brain, rather than going to sleep, actually stays online to collect data so that even unconsciously it can try to put together different things to steer you in the right direction. So what the faith does and what the reframing does is that it actually puts the brain in possibility mode so that the brain starts to look for solutions to the problems that you have.
That's amazing. It brings us a lot of certainty that we need to work on a positive attitude and positive thinking. So you're basically telling us that it's worth to coach ourselves to a more positive thinking, especially in regard, as you're talking about jobs, we think about the crisis that still exists in the U.S. and around the world. And what you're telling us is that if we work on a positive attitude and a positive thinking, we can tell the brain, prepare it to open up for a new perception of what's around.
Yes. Absolutely. Another part of this biology is that when the brain is in a state of threat, when we have negative thoughts, when we're in a state of fear, we basically ask our brains to start looking out for threat. Anyone who's afraid, if you're walking in a dark alley, for example, you tell your brain you have to be on the lookout for dangerous things. In a similar way, if you're afraid of the economy, if you're afraid of your relationships, or that you're not going to get what you want, you basically are telling your brain to look out for threat. So if you have 10 units of attention in your brain, the majority of those units, 8 to 9 of those units, just metaphorically, are going to be taking up their time looking for threat, you only have 2 units left to actually solve your problems. When you have positive thinking, you have more attention available because not all of your attention is spent looking for threat. And, people will sometimes say to me, but that sounds unrealistic. There are so many problems in the world, and there are real problems in the world. And my whole point about positive thinking is not that we have to be like cheerleaders and prevent that and try to act like everything is great. What we have to do is say to ourselves that things are often not great, but in order to take care of our own brains, what we need to do is spend a certain amount of the day focusing on the positive so that we can release attention to be able to look for solutions.
So then, Dr. Pillai, when we're talking about fear, it's great that you're enlightening us with the mechanisms and more underpinnings of fear, but we also understand that fear and guilt may be so intertwined that they start causing a lot of disruption, as you mentioned, in our perception. So do you agree that fear may be also a byproduct of guilt?
Yes, very much so. A lot of times when people feel guilty, they feel badly about doing something because guilt effectively comes from violating a personal or social norm. So, if somebody does something that goes against the norm, they start to feel guilty. Now, when you have guilt, you actually activate a host of brain regions as well. And some of those regions include the conflict detector in the brain, because that part of the brain, which is also called the anterior cingulate cortex, starts to overactivate when a person is having guilt. And this part of the brain feeds to the amygdala as well. So as we can see, there are overlapping brain circuits for fear and guilt. And that's one of the reasons, eventually, it really helps to be able to forgive oneself for the things that have happened. Forgiveness is not necessarily an overnight process, but I think to be oriented towards self-forgiveness can be really helpful because it can change some of this chaos that's going on in the brain and thereby put your brain in greater synchrony so that you can begin to find solutions for your life.
So we could tell based on what you're saying that there must be ways for us to coach our brains, if I may say this way, ourselves to overcome these obstacles. Is there enough evidence, scientifically speaking, to give us resources to overcome fear?
Absolutely. In fact, in Life Unlocked, one of the things I do at the end of every chapter is describe solutions to overcoming fears. Fears of failure, fears of success, which is also another counterintuitive thing, but a lot of people are actually afraid of their own greatness. How to overcome unconscious fears. There are 3 basic elements that I describe in the book. One is meditation, the other is attention, and the third is psychological insights. Now, when we say meditation, a lot of people think, meditation is some kind of abstract process. What effect is it actually going to have? Well, what we know is that meditation can actually decrease amygdala activation and improve the functioning of the thinking parts of the brain. It can cause a greater amount of synchrony, and it can also put the brain in a more relaxed state. And when that happens, the brain is able to process information much more effectively. In fact, on a daily basis, we live our days, but we have these constant distractions and interruptions from things that might have happened earlier in the morning or the day before. And this compromises the way in which we can actually function because we're constantly recalling these things that come up spontaneously. Well, what we know from brain imaging studies is that meditation decreases this level of intrusion. And as a result of that, it allows the amygdala to calm down, and it allows the thinking brain to function more effectively. So one mechanism that I think has accumulating evidence is meditation in a number of different situations. And, people don't have to be limited to, a particular faith-based meditation. They can explore different kinds of meditation. There are lots of non-denominational meditations. There are meditations that are called mindfulness, which is for all people of all religious denominations, involves essentially gaining a greater self-awareness and learning to connect with other parts of your consciousness. So meditation I think, plays a really important role when it comes to managing fear. Studies have actually shown that although, the paradox here is that at certain times I think thinking is really helpful. So reframing situations, using the strategy that I described, learning how to refocus your attention, all of those things are particularly important. The evidence actually shows, there's been a study, for example, that looks at two groups of people with equal amounts of pain. So they administer the same amount of pain to both groups of people. They ask one group of people to pay attention to the pain, and they ask the other groups of people, the other group not to necessarily pay attention to anything. Mm-hmm. And the group that looks at their pain, constantly stares at their pain, experiences more pain and reports more pain. So if we constantly focus on our emotional distress and we constantly just, try to analyze what's going on in it, it actually can cause that feeling to feel even greater. And that leads me to say that other studies have shown that if you compare what they call cognitive reflection, which is basically thinking over and over again, trying to understand where the fear is coming from, why it's coming, that is helpful. But in certain situations, emotional introspection, which means taking a deeper look at our emotions non-judgmentally, simply observing the way your emotions come and go, and this process is akin to meditation, emotional introspection decreases amygdala activation. So what this tells us is that we have a lot of things that are available to us to change our fears. Not only can we learn to think in particular ways that can actually reverse these fears, but we can also learn how to meditate and in that way access the unconscious through a non-thinking mechanism as well.
Wow. This is brings a lot of hope to us. And Dr. Pillai, we're going to listen right now to illustrate a little bit about the hardships of life. We have a case here from one of the books by Allan Kardec, The Heaven and Hell. It's about Joseph the blind man, a little bit on his story. And then we'll come back after the break to talk a little bit about it and then get to know more about these ways and means to overcome our fears.
Okay, that sounds good.
An excerpt from the book Heaven and Hell by Allan Kardec. Joseph Mitre, a blind man. Joseph Mitre belonged to the middle class of society and enjoyed a modest income that protected him from need. His parents provided him with a good education and meant for him to go into business. However, at age 20, he lost his sight. He died in 1845 when he was almost 50. Around 10 years prior to his death, he was struck with a second infirmity that left him completely deaf. Thus, he could only relate to the world of the living through the sense of touch. Not being able to see was in itself very hard, but not being able to hear was double torture. Having at first enjoyed all his faculties, he felt even more the results of this twofold privation. What could he have done to deserve such a cruel fate? It was not his last existence, for he had always displayed exemplary conduct. He was a good son with a gentle and benevolent character, and when he found that he had been deprived of hearing, he accepted the new trial with resignation. One never heard him utter a single complaint. His speech displayed perfect lucidity of his spirit and an uncommon intelligence. A person who had known him thought that useful instruction might be received by talking with his spirit. He was evoked, and the following communication was received in response to the questions addressed to him. And so the communication from Joseph began like this. My friends, I thank you for having remembered me, although maybe you would not have even thought of me if you hadn't expected to reap some benefit from my communication. Nonetheless, I know that your motives are authentic. Thus, I am pleased to have answered your call, and since I have been allowed to do so, I am happy to be able to serve for your instruction. May my example add to the many proofs that the spirits have provided you regarding the justice of God. You knew me to be blind and deaf, and you have asked yourselves what I had done to deserve such a fate. I'm going to tell you. First of all, it was the second time that I was deprived of my sight. During my previous existence, At the beginning of the last century, I went blind at 30 years of age due to excesses of all kinds, which ruined my health and weakened my organs. It was already a punishment for having abused the gifts I received from Providence, for I was very talented. But instead of realizing the fact that I was the original cause of my infirmity, I accused that same Providence, in whom I believed very little anyway. I blasphemed against God. I denied him and accused him by saying that if he did actually exist, then he must be unjust and evil for making his creatures suffer as I did. On the contrary, I should have considered myself fortunate because, unlike so many other unfortunate blind people, I didn't have to beg for my bread. No, I only thought about myself and about the privations that had been imposed upon me. Under the control of such ideas, and due to my lack of faith, I became cantankerous and demanding. In other words, unbearable to those who were close to me. From then on, life was purposeless. I couldn't think of the future except as a chimera. After futilely exhausting all the resources of science and realizing that my healing was impossible, I decided to end it all. I committed suicide. Upon my awakening, alas, I found myself immersed in the same darkness I had been in during life. However, it didn't take long to understand that I did not belong to the corporeal world, but that now I was a blind spirit. Life beyond the grave was thus a reality. I tried in vain to escape from it, to plunge myself into nothingness, but ended up simply clashing with the void. If this life were eternal as I had heard, would I be then in the situation for the rest of eternity? That thought was dreadful. I wasn't suffering, but to describe the anguish and torment of my spirit is impossible. How long did it last? I don't know, but it seemed so very, very long. Exhausted and weary, a change finally came over me. I understood that a higher power was weighing down on me, and I told myself that if this power could oppress me, it could also comfort me. And so I begged for mercy. As I prayed and as my fervor increased, something told me that my cruel situation would have an end. The light finally dawned, and my rapture was boundless at beholding the heavenly brightness. I could perceive benevolently smiling spirits, those who surrounded me, as well as those who hovered radiantly in space. I wanted to follow them, but an invisible force held me back. Then one of them said to me, "The God whom you used to deny has noticed your return to him and has allowed us to restore your sight. But you have yielded only because of constraint and exhaustion. If from now on you want to share in the bliss that we enjoy here, you must prove the sincerity of your repentance and good sentiments by recommencing your earthly trial under conditions that will expose you to falling again into the same wrongs. For this new trial will be even harsher than the last." I eagerly accepted, promising not to fall again. Thus, I returned to earth under the conditions you are aware of. It wasn't difficult for me to be good, because I wasn't evil by nature. I had revolted against God, and God had punished me. I returned with an inborn faith, and that is the reason why I no longer complained against him, but rather accepted my dual infirmity with resignation and as an expiation which had to have its origin in sovereign justice. I felt no desperation during the isolation of my closing years, for I had faith in the future and God's mercy. The isolation was very beneficial, because during that long night, wherein all was silence, my soul more freely uplifted itself to the eternal, foreseeing the infinite through thought. When my exile was finally over, the spirit world provided me with the splendors and ineffable delight. In comparison with my past, I deem my situation relatively very happy, and I give thanks to God for it. However, when I look to the future, I see how distant I still am from perfect bliss. I have completed my expiation, but I must still make reparations. My latest existence was only profitable to me alone, and now I hope soon to start a new existence where I can be useful to others, thereby repairing my previous uselessness. Only then will I be able to advance on the blessed path open to all spirits of goodwill. That is my story, my friends. If my example can help to enlighten any of my incarnate brothers and help them avoid the plight into which I had fallen, I will have begun to repay my debt. Joseph.
We will return to our program after these messages.
Spiritist Network, your gateway to on-demand Spiritist videos. www.spiritistnetwork.com.
Spread the word. Kardec Radio, to learn more about Spiritism.
Kardec Radio, live every Saturday at 11 a.m.
Nourish your soul with Kardec Radio.
Now in English, the book And Life Goes On by the Spirit André Luiz, psychographed by Chico Xavier. Buy your copy online or via your ebook reader. Go to www.ediceiofamerica.com today.
Spread the word. Kardec Radio, to learn more about Spiritism.
The Spiritist Magazine is a trimestral digital periodical that publishes the latest news on the Spiritist thought and the movement in the USA and worldwide. Subscribe now at www.spiritistmagazine.com.
Come and listen to our CD, Unfolding Our Spiritual Nature, Path of Harmony, by Dr. Raul Teixeira. The CD has questions and answers on euthanasia, suicide, pain relief, past life therapy, prayer and better attunement, law and affinity, the spirit world, raising our thoughts, and much more. You can purchase the CD by visiting SSB online bookstore at www.ssbaltimore.org.
And now we return to our program.
Dear listener, we're here to understand more about the underpinnings of fear, and also, and mainly, to say the truth, mainly to empower us to overcoming it. We need to get rid of fear. Is it possible? Dr. Pillai is here with us. He is this amazing psychiatrist who has been helping many people. A very bright mind that has opened a new understanding on our fears and how to overcome them. And he has been, as a brain imaging researcher, bringing great enlightenment on the mechanisms of therapeutic visualizations. In a previous session, he was mentioning to us that in the book Life Unlocked, 7 Revolutionary Lessons to Overcome Fear, he shares 3 main ways to overcome fear: through meditation, through mindfulness or focused attention, and some form of introspection. Dr. Pillai, you were telling us about these mechanisms on meditation, or let's say like therapeutic visualization. So you're saying these are not abstract movement of the mind. They are as tangible as the changes that they promote in our neurochemistry and the activation of the brain, right?
Very much so. In fact, there are now a tremendous number of studies, both done on mindfulness and on transcendental meditation, that show that when people meditate, it actually creates brain effects that you can see. You can see greater brain synchrony. You can see that there's decreased amygdala activation, or the emotion center is not as chaotic as it has been. And you can also see that it affects the thinking parts of the brain, so that there's clearer thinking and less intrusion from what we call the default mode network, or that part of the brain that is processing a lot of these under-the-radar thoughts. So I think meditations themselves are incredibly important. In terms of visualizations, I would add that in addition to that, and I highlight this both in Life Unlocked and in the Science Behind the Law of Attraction, when people talk about visualizations, a lot of times they also feel, this is just some kind of abstract thing, so it's not going to change my life if I think about something. If I write a check to myself and try to visualize it, it's not really going to come to me. So what is the biology behind this? Well, what we know is that when you imagine an action, you actually stimulate that part of the brain that's responsible for that actual action. So if I imagine lifting up my right hand, the part of my brain that usually activates when I actually lift up my right hand starts to activate. Mm-hmm. And the reason you don't move your hand when you're imagining it is twofold. One is there's some inhibition of the final step of movement, and the second is sometimes the imagination is sub-threshold. So it actually matters how you imagine if you want to activate your brain. For instance, when you imagine if I ask somebody, can you imagine seeing yourself on an athletic track? And if you say, what do you see? A lot of people will say, I see myself in white shorts, and I see myself, with a shirt and with a number flapping at the back, and you'll say, that's great. And what that is imagining yourself in the third person, because you're looking at yourself. But if you were actually on the track, you would need to imagine yourself in the first person, because when you're on the track, you can't see your back and you can't see your eyes. When you're on the track, all you can see is the track in front of you. So it's that level of detail that actually matters. Studies show that when you imagine in the first person, it activates different brain regions than when you imagine in the third person. They're both important. Sometimes people cannot handle imagining in the first person because it creates so much anxiety to actually put yourself in the situation. If I had to say to someone, imagine yourself having dinner with a person you've always dreamed of having dinner with, that you would be having this relationship that would feel incredibly fulfilling, people will probably maintain that for a couple of seconds, and then because it doesn't feel like it's real, they would drop it. So we know from the extensive research that's been done in sports psychology that imagining improves performance if you're doing it correctly. So, there are different kinds of things you can imagine, and this goes into a lot of different detail. For instance, in sports psychology, they show that if you want to improve confidence, there are specific kinds of things that you can imagine. If you imagine lifting up a trophy to see that you've won, that actually doesn't do as much for you as when you imagine that you're coming from behind. And one of the things I want to emphasize is that a lot of times people give up on therapeutic visualizations or give up on imagining because they don't spend the time practicing, or they expect that the first imagining is going to be really perfect. But the brain has this metaphorical camera, and so the first kinds of pictures that it takes may not be that great because you may have lots of intrusions, the picture may be of poor quality, and if you feed a poor quality image to your brain's navigator or GPS and then to your actual action center, it actually is not able to execute on what you want as effectively as a situation where you create a really great quality image. So if I asked everyone who was listening to say, okay, so close your eyes and imagine that you have, so let's take a common goal, which is a relationship goal, that you're actually in a relationship that you've always dreamed of for your life. And so everybody could do that. And then I would say, what color is the shirt of the person that you're looking at? Or does the person have long or short hair? Or where are you sitting when you're imagining? Every detail of that. When you create detailed brain pictures, it provides more information to the brain to be able to execute on it. And what a lot of people don't realize is that most of our problem solving occurs unconsciously. So if we create an image in our brains, we may not know how our brains use that image to take us to where we want to get to. But studies do show that, and this is most of this research comes from sports psychology, the clearer you imagine what's happening, the better you're able to perform. For example, expert athletes, expert swimmers or divers even, when they are able to imagine more effectively, they're able to swim faster or dive more effectively. Studies have shown that in people with stroke, going through imagination exercises improves the way you walk. And I'm not talking about imagining and moving. I'm saying simply imagining your ability to walk improves your ability to walk. And I think all of these examples show us the power of maintaining these visualizations, that meditation itself can help us create clearer images, and the therapeutic visualizations themselves, when they are powerful, can help communicate information to the brain so that the brain can execute on this.
That's interesting because this week we were at the Spirit Star of Baltimore studying Chapter 16 of the book Evolution in Two Worlds by Dr. André Lewis. And there he explains that the reason why this is so powerful in a more quintessential dimension is because of our spiritual body. You're sending a command, the spiritual body that modes the physical body starts recreating those connections that will show up later in the physical body. So Dr. Pillai, we would say that oftentimes you're talking about the unconscious, and it came to us that sometimes the noises, if we may say this way, quote unquote, when we're trying to visualize a successful scenario for us, whether it's like greater health or a job or greater relationships, etc., harmony, serenity, peace, sometimes these noises are unconscious and they are filled with lots of conflicts. So they can be a real roadblock for even the imagination, the creation of these images, the visualizations of what we want to feel and accomplish, right?
Absolutely. In fact, one of the way that I start Life Unlocked is by describing some of the experiments that we know that prove that there is an unconscious. So initially, we show people who are lying in a brain imaging scanner pictures of fear, and we see that it activates the amygdala. Now, if we show people pictures of fear between 10 and 30 milliseconds, so it's very quick, it's not long enough for the conscious brain to pick it up, but it is long enough for the unconscious brain to pick it up. So when we say to them, "What did you just see?" They are unable to say that they saw fearful faces. But when we look in their brains, we see that the amygdala still activates. So even though they're not aware that the fear has been presented to them, their brains are actually aware of it. And this sensitivity is so great that even in people who are blind, people who have a condition known as cortical blindness, which for all intents and purposes means they cannot see, if you show them a photograph of a fearful face, it activates the amygdala as well. And so the brain...
Go ahead, please.
The brain is that sensitive that it can pick up this image. And so, a lot of people will say, well, if you're blind, how could you possibly see the image? Well, the interpreting part of the visual cortex, or the part of the brain that interprets the image, is knocked out in blindness, and that's why people can't see. But the image does get as far as the place where it registers. And as soon as it activates the amygdala, the body starts to experience physiologic sensations that inform it that something negative has happened. The brain is still not able to interpret what it is seeing, and as a result, the person cannot see it. But the brain has registered this fear.
So in that regard, we're talking about the mechanisms and possibility of overcoming these fears. But is there a way that science would tell us it's possible to prevent engaging into these fearful mentality, mindset, attitude, whatever we want to call it?
Yes. In fact, that's what mindfulness is about. It's funny, one of the simplest conclusions from the fear research is also one of the most important conclusions. And that is that the problem with fear is not fear. The problem is fear of fear. So the relationship you have with fear is what causes the problems in people's lives. When you look at panic disorders or you look at any anxiety disorders, it's the fear of fear. And so one of the things we know is that if you can change your relationship with your emotions, you can actually change the way in which these emotions impact you. So, for example, in a previous situation, you might experience a quickened heart rate or some shortness of breath. People who are socially anxious might be afraid of going to a party. And so they go there, and all of a sudden they start feeling their hearts racing, and they start saying, oh my God, I'm going to get a panic attack, I'm afraid. In order to prevent that from happening, you have to develop a relationship with your emotions that allows you to observe them rather than have them possess you. So when you see the emotion come up, rather than saying, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening, you could say, oh, here goes my amygdala again. I guess it's activating for some habitual reason. So I'll just watch it while I'm continuing to move toward my goal. And when you actually train yourself in this way, you can prevent that harmful fear reaction from occurring, because rather than identifying with the fear and saying, I am my fear, the observation teaches you to say, I am going to observe my fear, and I am not my fear. I am something deeper and something different.
So, bottom line, we need to open up to train ourselves to get to a new awareness of our emotions and thus the creation of the scenarios we want to live in.
Absolutely. Because I think practice is really important when it comes to this. I think that, it's boring sometimes, and sometimes it requires a significant amount of discipline to actually sit down and go through particular things. But that's one of the reasons why in the book I sort of say, at the end of every chapter, we don't need to conquer all our fears at once. We don't need to set ourselves impossible goals. One step at a time, slowly, while we build up the practice. These principles are really important because it's the practice that's going to change your brain. The real optimism about this is that neuroplasticity exists. And what neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain to change. So we know we can change our brains, but it does take extensive practice to change the way in our wiring currently is.
And when you're saying about plasticity, even people who are older, because nowadays neuroscience has proved through experiments by Fred Gage in San Diego, California, and others, that we have newborn neurons in our brain, even when we're aging. It all depends on our exposure to the new, right?
Absolutely. Yes, very much so. It's even the aging brain can change. I would say that there are more challenges in an older brain than in a child or adolescent's brain, but there are also ways you can get around it. For example, it's difficult to change the neural circuits in what we call the primary areas. So, the eventual area that's responsible for movement or taste or touch or smell, it's difficult to change those areas. But it is possible to access those areas and create changes through what we call secondary areas or multimodal areas. And what that means is if you combine learning, sometimes if you listen to music while you are developing an attitude towards a new emotion, that can help you change your brain often more effectively when you use multiple modes of input to your brain under certain circumstances. So a person who is trying to focus on being calm, who's looking at a calm scenario, actually increases the chances of the ability to rewire their brain. And it doesn't have to be the same calm scenario for everybody. Different people feel calmed by different things. And it's the same thing with music. There are some people who are calm with opera. There are some people who get agitated when they listen to opera. There are some people who are calm when they listen to classical music. There are other people who get agitated. What you need to do is choose what is important for you and then try to combine either looking at something while you're thinking about something or listening to something. And this can actually increase the chances that you will get changes in your brain.
That's quite interesting. But you were mentioning about people who are blind and the fact that even though we may not see, we have these subliminal processes inside of our physiology that will allow us the triggering of emotions. And then we had a case here that we talked about the story of this man, Joseph, who was blind, and then he tells about these previous lives, choices. We're talking about action and reaction and the fact that he was blind. So he was helping us to reframe our fears, our emotions through the notion that life has a continuum. When you talk about visualizations and the fact that it's beyond just what we see, can you tell us a little more about it? Because it can be very empowering, Dr. Pillai, to our audience to know that it's not only what you are aware of, it's probably laid on the foundation of many things that we are not aware of, what we call the unconscious.
Sure, because fear can disrupt these visualizations, For example, if you take someone who's been in a relationship situation where they've been disappointed multiple times, and then you say to them, I'd like you to imagine yourself on a date at dinner with somebody treating you really well, and you're laughing and you're realizing that you're connected on multiple levels. It's an easy story to tell, but it's very difficult for a person who's been through a lot of difficult situations to start visualizing things. And so what we know is that if a person is given a visualization task, it's important to recognize that if you are not able to visualize, that perhaps unconscious factors are disrupting your ability to create that image. A lot of times fear doesn't appear as fear. It appears as inattention. And that's because the amygdala, the fear center, is connected to the thinking brain. And when it's unconscious, we're not aware that we're afraid, but the thinking brain is still disrupted. And so when we're trying to create an image, we may not be aware that the fear is there and disrupting the image, but it often is, and it's often worthwhile exploring this hypothesis. So visualizations are an extremely powerful way of getting to our goals because they provide important conscious and unconscious information. And the more you can visualize in multiple sensory media, the better. You know, if you're sitting at dinner, you can imagine yourself sitting at dinner, or you can imagine yourself sitting at dinner and smelling the smell and the ambiance and tasting the food that you really love. All of those things add reality to what you're actually doing. If you find that it's difficult for you to do that, then consider the fact that your prior experiences are changing the way in which you are experiencing the vision. And so rather than giving up at that point, ask yourself, is there something I can do to decrease my anxiety? Is there something that I can do to help myself feel better? Because when, stress actually disrupts the formation of images. And you can see this effect in the brain. Certain parts of the brain start to activate when you start to imagine. And when you put people in stressful situations, it starts to disrupt that. So the brain is trying to create an image, but when there's fear or stress, it actually can't because stress disrupts the activation of the image-forming areas in the brain. So the message there is it's important to persevere, to not give up, and if you can't form the image as vividly as you'd like to, consider the fact that if you help manage your own anxiety or get some help for managing your anxiety or resolve conflicts that exist in your life that you may not have addressed, this may help you visualize things a little bit better.
Dr. Pillai, we will need to give 1 minute of break for a few messages, and we'll be back with you because we have a caller ready in line for us, Fred Gouveia from New York, to ask you a question.
Great.
We will return to our program after these messages.
Now in English, the book Missionaries of the Light by the Spirit Andrea Luiz, psychographed by Chico Xavier. Buy your copy online or via your ebook reader. Go to www.ediceiofamerica.com today.
Nourish Your Soul with Kardec Radio.
Spiritist Network, your gateway to on-demand Spiritist videos. www.spiritistnetwork.com.
Dear listener, we have here with us Dr. Pillai, and he is unfolding new perspective for us. That's why Allan Kardec said we need to have a rational faith, because by knowing all the scientific underpinnings of our fear and the ways to overcome and the tangible ways in which meditation, visualization, mindfulness, psychological introspective can empower us, we will live a much better life, much more accomplished, with a less distorted perception of our reality, about ourselves, others, the world. And also, Dr. Pillai has these amazing books, from Life Unlocked to Your Brain Business and the Science Behind the Law of Attraction. Tangible notions, scientific evidences that are to all of us available in these books so we can live a better life. And talking about living a better life, we also have in the Spirit Society of Baltimore's website, our bookstore, the therapeutic visualization CDs on the inner journey and health through the Spirit Doc mentor, Joanna De Angelis, through the medium, Divaldo Franco. Amazing visualizations that have been helping many people already. And you can get a hold on this by logging on the website of the Spiritist Society of Baltimore, www.ssbaltimore.org/bookstore. Dr. Pillai is here with us, and he's going to answer the question by our dear Fred Gouveia from New York. Hi, Fred. Thank you for joining Kardec Radio.
Hi, Vanessa. Hi, Dr. Pillai. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're so welcome. How are you there in New York?
Good. Enjoying the weather that's changing slowly.
Great. So, Fred, we thank you for being with us at Kardec Radio. Dr. Pillai is here for you. Please Go ahead and ask your question.
I was listening earlier. I found this really interesting that we're talking a lot about music. I used to play violin throughout high school and later in college in orchestra, and I remember I had maybe 4 or 5 instances throughout those years where I experienced a full-blown panic attack while in the middle of a concert and orchestra. And I remember that those panic attacks were triggered by another musician in the orchestra making a mistake. That was clearly an audible mistake, and that would trigger my panic, my anxiety, and I remember that there's nowhere for me to escape because I was in the middle of a bunch of violins on stage in the audience, and I remembered I would start sweating profusely and trembling, but I still had to stay focused and continue playing through my part. And I remember that I read some books on the subject, and when it triggered again, I remember I would put myself in the observer position, and in many ways just let it go and observe myself sweating profusely and panicking, but trying not to be attached to that. And slowly it would go away, but it would seem, of course, like an eternity, those couple of minutes. And I wanted also to tie to what you mentioned about meditation, that it really is remarkable. Every morning, the days that I manage to meditate in the morning, the whole day unfolds in a much clearer way. And it was really nice to hear the way you were describing how meditation helps free up the parts of the brain for more clearer thoughts. And one thing that you mentioned that really struck me was the fact that sometimes fear can be disguised as inattention. And the days that I don't meditate is because I position myself to start meditating, and this current of thoughts start bombarding me left and right, and I give up, and I don't finish my meditation. So I wonder if there is a way that I can, I don't know if these are unconscious thoughts or it's just the default mode stream that you were mentioning earlier, but if there's a way that I can tackle them right there when I'm about to start my meditation so that I can actually finish it.
Sure. So there was a lot in what you said, and thank you for calling for your interest as well. Well, one of the insights I would add to what you described is that when you were experiencing that panic, part of what was happening is that the mirror neurons in your brain were probably activating. We have a system of neurons in our brains that are actually able to automatically represent other people's movements, intentions, and emotions automatically. So, if I move my left hand, your brain will actually represent the movement of my left hand because it is able to see, it is able to automatically represent my movement in your brain. And so when that person's error was occurring, it was intruding upon your notion of what you needed to play and was disrupting your own play, and that probably partly gave rise to the panic attack. The other component of that I would comment on is that sometimes my experience of working with people with panic is that panic actually occurs when someone's been going in automatic mode. When you play a musical instrument, you first learn consciously and then you embed a lot of that information unconsciously. So when you start playing unconsciously, you move in a very smooth way. But all of a sudden, when there's a mistake, it sometimes pulls your brain back into conscious thought. And when you're in conscious thought, you often get pretty lost because you suddenly lose the fluency of your own unconscious playing. So I would sort of mention that. I just wanted to add that to your perspectives on that. And then in terms of what to do when you're in a situation where you're not attending, I think using the thinking mechanisms to start out with would be great. And so there are two things I would suggest there. One is using that mnemonic that I mentioned, so resolving, reassessing, reframing, re-engaging, and refocusing. The idea is that when you, and the way that spells out a safe frame, if you take the words out, resolve, reassess, refocus, re-engage, and then reframe. It's safe frame. If you go through that process, you allow yourself to take a step back. The other things that have been shown is that small naps in the middle of the day can be very restorative to people and can help improve concentration. And some corporations have even included this in their own behavior. So, as long as you're not driving, if you're stationary somewhere, taking a small nap can actually help you refocus your attention. And then even if you don't have the time for the meditation, simply closing your eyes and watching all that chaos and watching all that distraction for just a few minutes will help you do what I call press the reset button. And as soon as you press the reset button, you get your brain back in gear. So I think that from the thought interventions, which I mentioned in the Safe Frame mnemonic, to either small naps or meditation, you can help, all of those things can help press the reset button to get you re-engaged.
I see.
That's quite interesting. Quite practical too, Dr. Pillai. Thank you so much, Fred, for being with us and for sharing your interesting and very personal account as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Congratulations on the show.
Thank you, Fred. And by the way, Fred Gouveia is going to be with us on Kardec Radio to talk about music and spiritism in January. So just wait and see the program that is going to be the layout, the schedule on KardecRadio.com. Dr. Pillai, you were talking about reframing, and maybe some of our audience may not quite understand the full spectrum of what this process of reframing may be. Can you please help us elaborate a little more on the mechanisms?
Sure. So reframing is essentially trying to look at the same situation from a different perspective. And one of the examples that I use in Life Unlocked is this example of Roger Bannister. So Roger Bannister was a person who broke the record for the 4-minute mile, meaning that he ran the mile in under 4 minutes. Now, prior to that, nobody in the world had been able to run that. And in fact, people had said it was physiologically impossible to run the mile in under 4 minutes. But the year after Roger Bannister ran the 4-minute mile in under 4 minutes, so he ran the mile in under 4 minutes, several people broke that record. And what that tells us is that once you begin to tell your brain that something is possible, it actually helps your brain reach for the thing that you want. So one important construct in reframing is, rather than simply stating the difficulty, what you do is frame things so that you say to your brain, I would like to find a solution. So instead of saying, it's really impossible for me to find a new job, what you can say is, it is possible, but I don't see the way yet, and I wonder what that may be. That simple reframing is particularly important. In a situation where you break out into a panic, or what you can say is, rather than saying, "Oh my God, I can't believe I think I'm going to collapse," you can reframe that to say, "I'm used to my physiologic reactions occurring in this way. Even though they're uncomfortable, they will pass." That actually changes the message that you're giving to your brain, and it feeds back into your brain and helps you think about things in a different way. A lot of people will often argue based on probability. They'll say, well, what's the probability that I'm going to become a billionaire? What's the probability I'm ever going to find someone who's good for me after 3 failed relationships? Well, the probability is very low. But one of the thoughts I'd like to share with you is that nothing exceptional in life has ever been highly probable. By definition, if you want an exceptional life, it is going to be an exception, which means it is not going to be highly probable. So using the probability frame to try to tell yourself, well, it's not highly probable, let me do something realistic, you are immediately limiting the possibility of living an exceptional life. I mean, if you think about it, imagine if before anybody went to the moon, and if people said, what's the probability, people would have said very low. It's not, it's really not a highly probable event. But people demonstrated that it was possible. In the same way, if you frame to yourself that even though this is not very probable, I am not interested in probability, I'm interested in possibility, this actually changes what happens. Somebody actually asked me recently with a client I was working with, and that was an interesting situation because it turned out that what I felt the client needed was actually a different doctor because they asked me about the prognosis and what it meant. And the prognosis, in my mind, although I think I like to know it, it doesn't really matter to me at all, because if there's a 5% chance that someone is going to recover, I will still want to put that person in the 5% bracket. I'm not going to say, well, there's a 95% chance that you're not going to get better, so let me give up on you. And in that particular instance, there were people in the family who actually didn't want to hold that hope, because sometimes hope is burdensome. You know, if you're holding a hope when there's a 95% probability that you're going to be crushed, a lot of people will just lose the hope. But what I would say is, why not reframe that? So since I have the rest of my life to live, the whole idea of pursuing that 5% is learning new things. And along the way, so many discoveries can occur. So even though we may not reach our eventual goals, when we start our course toward that goal, along the way, there are multiple discoveries. That in itself is a reframe. So to go back to your original question, what is a reframe? Technically, a reframe is a way of taking the story of your life and repackaging it. And you see the impact of this in multiple contexts. You know, if you take, this is a generalization, but, in general, products have associated pink things with girls and blue things with boys. If you took the same toy and you packaged it in pink wrapping and you painted it pink, it would have a completely different effect. So it's important not to underestimate how you are reframing something. If something in you says, well, why tell myself the story in a different way, I think it's important to follow that up with saying, well, brain imaging studies have shown that my brain will actually process information differently. I know from these marketing studies that the way you package things actually matters. And I know that if I tell my brain that something is possible, it will stay online, whereas if I tell it that something is impossible, it will say, thank you, good night, I'm going to sleep, let me know when you want me to find out the solution.
That's quite interesting the way you put it. And Dr. Pillai, we have here Kirsten DeMello to relay a question from one of the listeners to you. Hi, Kirsten.
Hi. Hello, Dr. Pillai. How are you? Hi, guys. Thank you for having me.
Sure. Hi, Kirsten.
Hi. So the question is that knowing a little, as people know a little bit about psychology and how the brain works, how the mind works, sometimes as we understand it, we sort of suppress our fears or different types of emotions. And so the therapeutic techniques that you're talking about, if people have suppressed emotions, for instance, fear or fears, do you, in your professional experience perspective, do you think that these techniques, the reframing, could even help our subconsciousness deal with some issues that perhaps we're not entirely aware of, but surface a little bit, manifest a little bit, but not in its entirety.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I do, and the reason I do is because reframing has been shown to change amygdala activation, which is in the unconscious. So I think reframing can change the unconscious. But one of the things I enjoyed about your question is that I think it reminds us that when we're reframing, it's important to be in an authentic space. If you're simply saying to yourself, oh, I want to be in a great relationship, but you have no feeling about the possibility of that, it's actually very difficult to deal with the reality of that. And similarly, if you say to yourself, I'm going to suppress my fear, simply using force is not something that I would recommend. What I would recommend is, if you're going to reframe, authentically realize that the reframing, once you practice it, will become an automatic different way of doing things. Otherwise, what you find yourself doing is fighting the amygdala, and the amygdala is a pretty good fighter. It'll fight you right back. And so a lot of times the amygdala springs back with a tremendous amount of fear because all we've done is suppress the fear inauthentically. And so what I would want to add to what you're saying is that it's important to respect the unconscious in that process, recognize that part of the way we respect the unconscious, if we want to change it, is to repeat. Because when we repeat, and to repeat with authenticity, because it is that authenticity that will get our brains to accept that information as real. So if you have a lot of fear, for example, so say you're a person who gets afraid when you go to parties, rather than gritting your teeth and saying, I'm just going to do this, that is one approach, but there are a lot of people who can't do that. It's important to say to yourself, I wonder what it is that's making me feel this way. Perhaps I imagine that I am more different than I actually am. Or perhaps I imagine everybody else is really comfortable when they're not. the more you start to explore this authentically, the easier it is to keep the fear at bay.
So thank you so much, Kirsten. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Pelayo. That's very enlightening, and thank you guys so much for having this show. I think it's so empowering what you're saying to our listeners, I think more than what they even begin to realize, because Spiritism talks about what you talk about. I mean, it may be under different header, but it does touch on the subject. So thank you for bringing this to the show today, and I'm going to continue listening. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for your question.
And Kirsten brought us this question. It brought to our awareness the fact that sometimes many people have a disconnect between their reasoning and their emotional processing, Dr. Pillai. So even when we study pain, we neuroscientists of pain have been trying to understand how emotions can be so interconnected with the perception of pain that they may, as you gave an example of experiments, either you focus on pain or you're not, and it may change the whole experience. So oftentimes we have been mentioning about the need of probably creating schools of emotions to create greater awareness on our emotional intelligence. Would you say that emotional awareness and also spiritual awareness would be good ways to reframe fear and promote a more, let's say, a fulfilled life?
Absolutely, because I think a lot of things that so I definitely think that emotional intelligence and spiritual intelligence are important and very critical issues when it comes to life's meaning. Because if you restrict yourself to purely rational meaning, you actually restrict yourself to a more limited life. And I like to distinguish between rational, non-rational, and irrational. And one of the things I like to remind people about is not everything that is non-rational is irrational. You may feel a love for your child, and that may not be a conscious thought that's rational, but it's not irrational either. It's non-rational in the sense that it's not just, I love my child because X, Y, or Z, but it emanates from some emotional center. So I think it's much more fulfilling when you allow yourself to express yourself both through your emotions and through your spirituality, because life starts to reveal things to you about the nature of what it is to be human beyond simply your rational thought. I think if you limit yourself to what you see, then you're really limiting your capacity to experience life fully as a human being, because the actual mental state of spirituality is different than one that is purely rational.
Yeah, Dr. Pillai, we are so delighted with so many good news you're sharing with us. It feels so truly empowering. We're in the final moments of the show today about overcoming fears. Would you kindly please share your final comments for the show today, hoping that we can have you back in the near future with much more on so many things that you are publishing in your books and the works that you're doing.
Thank you so much. Yeah, the main thing that I would want to say to people is that all human beings are fallible. All human beings are vulnerable. We all struggle with this or that or the other. If you're feeling alone, you're actually not alone. And I think that the more we begin to understand that as a community of human beings, we are all experiencing these kinds of difficulties. Why use the hypothesis of fear if you can use the hypothesis of hope? And so hope, I believe, opens doors, and it allows you to look for solutions. So even if you don't see the solution immediately, I would highly recommend that you persevere, because your brain may see that before you actually know that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pillai. Please receive a big hug from us as a deep gratitude for the much that you have shared with us today, and we hope you come back to Kardec Radio to share much more. Our audience is surely delighted by the much you have brought us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to share these views, and I'd be delighted to be back. Thanks so much.
Thank you. So, dear listener, right now we are here in the final moments of Kardec Radio, and we want to share with you that there is hope. As Dr. Pillai shared with us, there is hope. Hope that if we keep persisting, if we keep working, everything is going to be reframed. You can change your life by changing your thoughts. All we need is to be the coach of ourselves by being accountable for our actions, even though we're not perfect, but we're perfectible. And that's what Spiritism brings to us. Say no to your fears. Say yes to your own capacity to overcome them. Dr. Pillai told us quite clearly that our brains are capable to be changed according to the instructions we're giving to our own selves. So in these final moments of these realizations, we want to share with you that in the book Gospel According to Spiritism, the last chapter, which is chapter 28, Kardec shares with us the fact that we can pray even in the moments of greatest fear. As he said, the moment of imminent danger, if we are feeling that it's a real danger or not. Let us go deeper into this. It's item 34 of chapter 28, when Kardec shares, by means of dangers we face, God reminds us of our weakness and the fragility of our existence, showing us that our life is in His hands and that we are upheld by a thread that may snap at a moment when we least expect it. From this point of view, no one is privileged, because both great and small are subject to the same alternatives. If one examines the nature and consequences of danger, one will see that most often such consequences, if they have occurred, they are a reminder for either a wrong committed or a duty neglected. So we can pray, he says. A very short prayer in the moments we're feeling greatly distressed by a threat, by danger, an imminent danger, by saying, Almighty God, and you, my guardian angel, help me. If I should succumb, may God's will be done. And if I'm spared, may I, for the rest of my life, repair the wrong I surely committed and for which I now repent. In afflictions of life, we may all open our hearts to God's great helping, loving hand. God does not punish us. It's just a way of saying that God is bringing us reminders that we are born for much better than we can ever imagine. There is a life full of possibilities ahead of us, dear listener. Next week, let us then empower ourselves from the very beginning of a new life. It's about reincarnation. It's about motherhood, mindful motherhood. Next week at 11 a.m., Saturday, October the 8th, Dr. Cassandra Witten from the Noetic Society Institute is going to be with us talking about her book, Mindful Motherhood, and ways in which we can spiritually and psychologically empower the new life that is lying ahead in pregnancy. So be back with us next week. And now let us all send our best wishes and also our deepest gratitude to Dr. Pillai for the much he's doing to humanity and for being here with us today at Kardec Radio. Thank you, and may God bless us all.
Thank you for listening to Kardec Radio, broadcasting live every Saturday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Email us and share your comments at www.kardecradio.com. Until next time, we wish you many blessings.